Welcome back to the program. As I said before, we get to the crisis and turmoil in national politics this week. I do want to have a look at international affairs because it has been a very significant week with President Obama visiting Israel and Jordan, trying to kickstart or restart the peace process there. And I'm joined in the studio today by Professor Alan Johnson, a visiting expert from the British Israel Communications Research Centre. And of course, you've come out here through the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council. Thanks for joining us. Now, President Obama stood back from the Middle East. A lot of US presidents have tried to get involved and make progress there, but President Obama stepped back, really, held back during his first term. Now that he's re-elected, he's decided to re-engage on that issue, or for the US to re-engage on the issue, and obviously that's why we saw the visit this week. Is that a good sign for the Middle East peace process?
I think it is. I think it was a very successful visit. I think it was an enormously successful speech he delivered in Jerusalem. He had two objectives really coming over. Forgive the cliche, but he wanted to press reset in a couple of ways. I think an emotional reset in terms of his relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu and with the Israeli people, who didn't think he had quite the affinity that certainly Bill Clinton had. But also the visit was about pressing reset on policy. It was a serious policy summit, 4.5 hours behind closed doors with the Prime Minister, looking at the Middle East peace process, Syria and Iran. Yeah,
you mentioned that speech in the university in Israel. We'll just go to a little clip of that now and you'll get a sense of what the President was trying to say.
Part of the reason I like talking to young people is because no matter how great the challenges are, their idealism, their energy, their ambition always gives me hope. Look at the world through their eyes. It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own.
There's the President focusing on youth and on hope. And we often hear the President talk about hope, but this is a difficult, many say intractable problem. But there are already signs of success, aren't there? Because he's been able to get the Israelis to resume diplomatic relations with Turkey, which is crucially important given, of course, what's happening in Syria.
Absolutely. This was one of the great successes of the trip. It was apparently achieved on the tarmac as President Obama was leaving. We know that for 3 years he's been desperate, really, for both men to forge a new relationship with each other. America sees both Turkey and Israel as an ally and is uncomfortable about these two allies having fallen out. So there's been an apology issued and a better relationship will develop between the two countries.
Now, what about the peace process between the Palestinians and Israel? We've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu re-elected, a hard-line Prime Minister, you'd have to say, but he's had to form a coalition government which has very disparate elements, and people are starting to see even President Netanyahu as someone who could really help deliver or a restart on the negotiations with the Palestinians.
Absolutely. I think there's cause for some cautious optimism at the moment. Prime Minister Netanyahu said from the floor of the Knesset when the new government was sworn in that he was ready, if the Palestinian partner was on the other side, to make a historic compromise and end the conflict. He's talked a language of two states for two peoples as he stood shoulder to shoulder with President Obama. There's a new American Secretary of State, John Kerry, very keen, says he has new ideas, wants to jump into the water and get something moving. We're told he's going to bring the parties together in May for a summit. That's looking possible.
You're not getting all dewy-eyed on us, are you? I mean, obviously people want to be optimistic, but we've been there before.
We have. I think there's one of the great shadows over the process at the moment is of course, Hamas, the radical extremist Islamist organisation which controls the Gaza Strip. The Palestinians are split between the more moderate pro-two-state Fatah organisation on the West Bank and the extremists in Gaza. Now, when President Obama was in Israel, 4 rockets were fired from Gaza. 2 landed in Gaza itself, 2 came over into Israel. Earlier this month, there was a medium-sized missile landed in Ashkelon, an industrial area, and terrible things could happen if one of those rockets ends up in the wrong place in the wrong kind of industrial plant. So Hamas are a real worry.
And is there any chance that Hamas could seize control in the West Bank?
It's a fear. The fear that some Israeli policymakers have is that a deal could be struck with the apparently moderate Fatah organisation today, but tomorrow, if Hamas grows stronger, they could take over in the West Bank. Now, there's some signs that Hamas feel with the Muslim Brotherhood backing in Egypt, with a very large financial transfer, $400 million from Qatar, and with new supplied weaponry from Iran, they could become a stronger force than Fatah. There's no sign of that at present, and certainly America feels it has a partner partner. Israel has a partner on the West Bank, but that's certainly a fear for the future.
Now, of course, the President also went to Jordan, and of course, with neighbouring Syria in absolute bloodshed and turmoil at the moment, there was discussion there about military intervention, not just by America, by the international community generally. Let's have a look at what the President had to say about that. This is in the context of what to do about Syria.
The United States often finds itself in a situation where if it goes in militarily, then it's criticized for going in militarily. And if it doesn't go in militarily, then people say, why aren't you doing something militarily?
There we are. It's 10 years on now from the invasion of Iraq. And so when you see the questions like that being asked about Syria, no wonder the President is very cautious, Alan. But what is the answer in Syria, and what role can the United States play?
I think it is a real dilemma for America and for the West more generally. No one's really talking about a boots-on-the-ground, open-ended intervention in Syria. That obviously would be a poor idea, given how what we're looking at in Syria is not the people as a whole as against a regime, but more like a civil war developing between different groups within Syria. So that kind of an intervention is not possible. However, if the West stands back too much, it risks this problem developing, which is that the radical Islamist forces in the region will have a free play inside Syria, begin to dominate the Syrian rebel forces and the future Syrian government. Now, to some extent, that's exactly what's been happening. It looks like the Syrian rebels are dominated by some more Islamist extremist forces. In response, in more recent times, the West has decided to start playing a more proactive role, training up as far as possible those less extreme forces which will be more friendly to the West, supplying them with non-lethal weapons and with training. And some people want to supply more lethal weaponry also. So they're trying to get past the dilemma by finding the forces on the ground who would support the West and supplying them when they can.
Now, the other major issue in the region, and I would suggest, interested to get your thoughts, it's probably the preeminent issue behind the scenes, especially when the President was speaking in Israel with behind closed doors with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I would have thought the preeminent issue would have been Iran. And do you think it perhaps was the main purpose of the President's visit was to try and make sure that Israel was in lockstep with the United States on Iran, that Israel would not strike against the Iranian nuclear program and would wait and allow the US to take that action if it's necessary?
I think you're right. I think that's exactly what a good part of the trip was about. If you think about the Jerusalem speech, it was really a speech of two parts. The first part of the speech was trying to be as reassuring as possible to Israel, to say this is a great society, wonderful people, with a solid partnership with America. And at one point, using Hebrew, he said, you know, as long as the United States of America is around, Israel will be around and have a strong ally. But his purpose, I think, in all of that reassurance in the first part of the speech was to pivot in the second part of the speech to say, on Iran, trust us, leave it to us. He was trying to say through the trip, we believe in prevention, we're going to stop Iran getting the bombs, we haven't drifted away to a containment regime where we will allow Iran to get the bomb, you need to trust us on that. We also know there's been a lot of sharing of intelligence, so Israelis can be convinced that there's a credible American plan.
Is this inevitable now, that there must be some sort of military strike to put an end to Iran's nuclear, or at least set back Iran's nuclear program?
I don't think at the moment it's inevitable. I don't think there's any war party on either side for this. Everyone wants to prevent Iran getting the bomb short of war. I think there's ongoing negotiations. The P5+1 talks are ongoing. They're moving to Kazakhstan next. The position increasingly shared by America and Israel and others, I think, is that if a credible military threat is on the table, then possibly the sanctions, which are really biting into the Iranian regime, and the diplomatic effort can have its effect. And this is why I think it's so important that all options are on the table and are seen by the Iranians to be on the table.
All right, Professor Alan Johnson, I want to talk to you about another area of expertise. You've done a lot of work in the UK on Islamic radicalisation. It's been a major issue, of course, in the UK, with large numbers of radicalised young Muslims in the UK. And of course, you had that manifest itself in the underground bombings of 2005 on the London Underground. I wonder if you can tell us just how deep this problem is for the UK, and whether the UK is finding ways to resolve the issue and to prevent further radicalisation.
Well, I interviewed a a series of young men and women who'd got themselves involved in Islamic extremism in the UK and then got themselves out. So the project was in and out of extremism. So we asked them a lot of questions over many hours. Why did you get involved? What attracted you about these organisations? Who recruited you? How did they recruit you? How did you become disillusioned and get out again? The top line was there's some cause for optimism. I didn't find a politics or a way of acting that was shared with many Muslims. It was a minority of a minority who were attracted to this, and it wasn't a politics that was going to go into the future. Now, of course, a minority of a minority can cause mayhem, as they did on 7/7 and tried to do on 21/7 and have tried to do ever since. But the story in part is about a Muslim community going through a bit of a silent revolution. There's many middle-class Muslims now participating in politics and civic life. So we have to be careful not to brand the whole community, but to target our attention to those people who are vulnerable.
Well, the reason, of course, I'm particularly interested in this issue, and a lot of our viewers will be, is because there are similar issues in Australia, not to the same extent in terms of numbers or impact, I don't think, but of course we have had homegrown terrorist threats here. They have been thwarted. We have had people arrested and charged with plotting terrorist attacks in Australia, and we have had some rather ugly demonstrations in response, for instance, to that video last year about the Prophet Muhammad. So this is an issue in Australia. What would you advise Australia needs to do in terms of that civil society to prevent the radicalisation of young Islam people in Australia?
Well, there was one extremist, a man called Maajid Nawaz, and Maajid wrote a book called Radical, which you can find. Maajid said, in a nutshell, what made him a radical was, he said, the fire within me found its oxygen. He meant that the fire within was a vulnerability he had, and the oxygen was the Islamist recruiters who then drew him into the organisation. I think you need to look out for vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities are experiences of racism, which makes people very angry and alienated from the society. Also a certain kind of identity crisis. For many British Muslims, certainly, they felt that they weren't fully accepted as British in Britain, and they weren't fully accepted as Pakistani in Pakistan. So they felt a little lost, a little rootless, and a little vulnerable because of that. Another factor was what we call spiritual seeking. These were often people who the imams couldn't speak English. The imams were old and boring and couldn't relate to the younger people and couldn't explain the troubles in their life and relate them to the religion. The young, sharper, Western-educated extremists could, and they drew them in because of that. And also separation. Be careful when communities become wholly separate from mainstream society and don't mingle in workplaces and in communities with others. If that vulnerability is around, the Islamist recruiters, Islamists on the prowl, we said, who are experienced recruiters trying to find people who are vulnerable, what they do is they reinterpret that experience and they say, I can explain why you feel angry, why you feel alienated, and they explain it in the terms of Islamism as a political ideology, and they draw them into the organisation that way. So the vulnerabilities are there.
And this process you expect would be happening in large Muslim communities all the time, and people should be vigilant about it, but you're saying for the broader community, the best thing to do is to try and engage as much as possible with the Islamic community.
Absolutely, and for that minority which is attracted, the couple of things we learned that are important are a society has to be proud of itself. It has to project itself as something that can be proud, that you should be attracted to. So I think I get the impression that Australia has learned some lessons that we took a long time to learn, which is that multiculturalism can be of different kinds. The multiculturalism which says anything goes, who are we to judge you, which loses the ability to judge as a society, loses the ability to draw a line and say we don't do things that way, this is the way we do them, is a problem. A multiculturalism which says everyone can have their own religion and faith and culture and express that in the public square, but the society as a whole has core values. And those core values we're proud of, we teach them in our schools, and you must adhere to them. That's a much more reliable way of combating extremism than the anything goes approach.
Thanks very much for that. I appreciate your insights. They're very useful. I hope you've enjoyed your stay in Australia. I know you're involved with the Labor Party back in Britain. I won't force you to share your thoughts about the sister organisation here in Australia.
Thank you.
All right. That's Professor Alan Johnson from the UK, an expert on Israel, the Middle East, and as you've heard there, Islamic radicalisation. I'll be back after the break with a great panel to pick over the entrails of that leadership crisis.